Hi, everyone, and welcome to another installment of the ISP speaker series. Today we have Professor Daria Roithmayr to be a speaker. So Professor Roithmayr is a professor of law at the University of Colorado, Boulder. Before that, he taught for 17 years at USC. And she writes and teaches on the dynamics of racial inequality, particularly the persistence of structural disparities in labor, housing, political participation, wealth, and education. She has a book from NYU Press, Reproducing Racism, How Everyday Choices Lock in White Advantage. And today she'll be giving a talk on racism pays, racial exploitation in the digital age. So take it away.
Thank you very much. So I'm very excited to be here, both because this is a book project. I'm waiting to hear about the book proposal at any moment, but also I'm delighted to be here. I visited here in 2018, 2019, well before your time, most of you, and had a fantastic experience. So I'm glad to be back, in no small part because I know the kind of feedback that I get from a project like this, from a group like you, will be beneficial to the project. So, as I explained, this is part of a book project. I wrote a paper because I wasn't quite sure whether the book would write. And once the paper came out, I realized that there were some changes I had to make. But what really has motivated me in terms of this project is reflected in the quote that you see in front of you. Visionaries derive their power partly from the blinders that they have on, including the suffering that they ignore. And this is from Daron Acemoglu, who I'm told came and gave a presentation here as part of the private law colloquium. And they have a book, he and Robinson have a book out on progress and power. And I thought it really captured a lot of what the school of thought in which I write, racial capitalism, is about. This notion that innovation and the vision for the future of the economy is frequently extracted at the price of suffering, and suffering from structurally vulnerable groups, and in particular, communities of color. But I wanted to fix this quote because it was the suffering that they ignore, suffering that they look away from, but in this case, it's also suffering that visionaries cause. So here is the history that everybody knows in the context of racial capitalism. So the book that I highly recommend to you on this subject is by Sven Beckert, called The Empire of Cotton. And he writes about the way in which capitalism, i.e. the mills of Manchester, as industrial capitalism, get jump-started by the launch of the global cotton economy. And that's made possible by the raw refined cotton exported from the United States, picked by enslaved people. And the possibility of the global cotton economy as an institution that is not entirely mediated by market transactions is, of course, based in the expropriation of human bodies and labor through the institution of slavery, and then also the genocide, relocation, and theft that make possible the large tracts of land that cotton plantations need. And because there were others already on the land, they had to clear them in order to be able to create these large-scale plantations. And until that point, things had been small, artisanal, and not mass-produced. So it was this scaling up of production, a common theme that you're going to see in our conversation about the digital economy, that necessitated the expropriation and theft of bodies and land that preceded the launch of the global cotton economy. So part of my project is to update these stories of racial capitalism to the modern age. And when it comes to the digital age, many people do think of, I'm certainly not the first to suggest, that the digital age is one that exploits workers, that relies on this worker exploitation, particularly with regard to misclassified independent contractors. So the idea that they're not employees, so they don't get benefits and they're not allowed to organize, and They are, in some sense, left to settle the terms and conditions of their contractually mediated employment themselves. This is exploitation and not expropriation because it is mediated by a market transaction. There are contracts involved. But these are contracts that work to the disadvantage of exploited workers. They're earning sub-minimum wages. They have no legal protections or ability to organize, and it's not even possible for them to negotiate for that because these contracts are take it or leave it contracts that aren't individually negotiated the way that often independent contractors negotiate their contracts. So there's a lot of work out there on this. The literature is quite extensive and voluminous about the general exploitation of gig workers in the digital economy. So what do I have to add to that story? So the real story, I claim, in the book and the paper is first that digital innovators are relying not just on exploitation, but on racial exploitation to be able to jumpstart their innovations. Racism, it turns out, supplies the monopsony power to exploit. I'm going to tell you all about monopsony power. That makes it possible for this exploitation to occur, which isn't to say that there isn't monopsony power generated by other factors, but racism in terms of the communities of color and the workers of color that I talk about is what fuels the monopsony power to exploit. And it's important to note that I'm arguing that while innovators didn't entirely create these racial barriers, although there are some instances in which they do, they are exploiting these racial barriers, and in particular, by rewriting the rules of work that make possible not just the independent contractor, but now these intermediate forms of work that are not employee, not independent contractor, but something in between that still allow them to exploit workers of color, as we'll see. The second part of the argument is to narrow down on this racial exploitation institutional form to notice that the extreme degree of racial exploitation that racism makes possible enables new forms of work that are distinctive to the digital economy. So as we'll talk about, network markets of the kind that digital platforms are but one form need to blitz scale, meaning scale up extremely fast, extremely big, get big fast, at a low cost in order to capture the all-important first mover advantage that is so important for network markets. And racial exploitation makes this blitz scaling possible. And indeed, Lucas Beevald, the CEO of Crowdflower, described in an interview that you can find on YouTube his ideal workforce for the kind of platform that he was the leader of as being the availability of tens of thousands of cheap, anonymous workers whom you could hire and fire without ever knowing their name or anything about them at the touch of a button on an app, working for sub-minimum wage. This is the ideal workforce that the digital economy both makes possible and relies on. And my contention is that racial exploitation makes this kind of ideal workforce possible. So here's what I'm going to do in the minutes that I have. I'm going to talk to you theoretically about monopsony power and the relationship between racism and the power to exploit. We're going to talk about the case study of Uber, and if I have time, I'll mention two others that I cover in the book. And then we're going to talk about the payoffs of racial exploitation to the innovators. What does racial exploitation make possible that's distinctive to the digital economy employer? We're going to say hand-wavy things about remedies, and then we'll wrap up. So part of what interested me in this story was the availability of new empirical research on the relationship between monopsony power and exploitation. So this is work by people like Aaron Dubé, Suresh Naidu, and Eric Posner, I call him Baby Posner, he's Richard Posner's son. And they are doing work that show that most workers lack outside options, meaning options other than exploited positions. And that's because employers have monopsony power. So a competitive market looks one way, a monopolistic market looks another way, a monopsonistic market looks much like the monopoly market, but for labor, as opposed to the purchase of commodities. And in the healthy competitive market, there are lots of outside options. It's what allows competitors to compete down the price of the good to reflect the marginal marginal cost of production. The monopsonistic market, same idea, except that there are no outside options. And so now the employer is under no competitive pressure because the workers aren't able to relocate. The employer has monopsony power, and this enables the employer to drop market wages to what the worker will take. I mean, it's a little more complicated than that, but basically the employer no longer has to compete with other employers because the worker can't move to those other employers or they're not available to this worker population. And so now wages will be less than the marginal revenue product of labor. And it is this that I define as exploitation. So this is Pigouvian exploitation if you're economically minded. And I define exploitation as the failure to pay the marginal revenue product of labor. That is the revenue earned from a marginal worker. So there are lots of debates about how to define exploitation. I'm super sympathetic to the Marxist definitions of exploitation. So anything that deprives the worker of the surplus value given property law. And I rely a lot on that when I think about remedies like worker ownership. But this definition, trafficking as it does in the neoclassical definition of exploitation, really makes for a stronger argument because you don't get bogged down in the definition of exploitation. And this, I think, has both some rigorous support for it. Depending on who you talk to, Marx is not quite as rigorous, but this is the definition from which I proceed. So where Dubé, Naidoo, and Posner talk about general restrictions on outside options for the average worker, what I contribute is a focus to restrictions on outside options that are distinctive for minoritized populations. So there are racial differences in outside options that reflect structural and intentional racism in a very distinctive way that form the basis of this argument that I am making. And the reason there's a funnel there is because these restrictions on outside options end up funneling workers of color and immigrant workers into these exploited positions. So here are some of the restrictions I discuss. First is the restrictions in access with regard to human capital in terms of education and experience. That seems relatively uncontroversial. Less well known is the set of restrictions that a worker faces with regard to looking for a job. Most people look for a job using their professional and social networks. The networks that a person of color has are more likely to be filled with people who are unemployed or underemployed in jobs that have much less of an opportunity for advancement and are much less stable compared to white workers. The structure of those networks is distinctively different. So you may be familiar with the idea that loose ties are the best way to get a job, not your father's best friend, but their best friend or their best friend's best friend. And people of color tend to have networks that are much more clustered, meaning people are already likely to all know each other in the network. And that restricts the amount of information that comes into the network, lets the search span range a lot closer to home, and provides a lot less potential referrals with regard to a job network. And the research suggests that these structural differences and differences in terms of who is included in the network can reflect a significant lower number of offers. Padula and Pager suggest that these restricted job search networks result in half the number of offers for Black job seekers as for whites with the same networks. They did a little experiment in that regard. This is also relatively well-known bias in terms of stereotypes regarding the productivity of workers of color ends up restricting offers with regard to recruiting and hiring. There are these famous resume studies in which identical resumes are sent out, who gets the offer to come back to interview. And Daria Pager and her team of researchers suggest that those differences with regard to just out and out a subconscious or intentional discrimination ends up reflecting a third of the racial wage gap. There are many more things to talk about: involvement in the criminal justice system, having racial disparities with regard to wealth. How long can you go without a job? You know, do you have the wealth to tide you over until you find your new job? People of color have 10 and 8 cents on the dollar of wealth with regard to whites, so they can be without a job for a far shorter period of time. All of this reflects much bigger restrictions on outside options, meaning options other than the exploited digital platform job. And these restrictions end up conferring monopsony power to the employer. Think about it in a very simple, intuitive way. If you know your workers can't leave, what will you do with regard to setting their wages? If you know your workers can leave, so the theory is that in a competitive market, if the employer drops wages by a penny, this is the theory, of course, by a penny, everyone will instantly move to other jobs that pay the fair market value of their labor. That does not happen if workers are restricted with regard to outside options to move to. And so this restriction in terms of outside options ends up conferring a lot of monopsony power to set lower wages, exploitative wages, remember the definition, in markets with restrictions. And so this lack of outside options ends up funneling workers of color with relatively fewer outside options into the more exploited positions. We know this with regard to labor markets, with regard to janitorial services, domestic workers, agricultural workers, people who are seasonal workers, for example, tend to be undocumented immigrants, especially in the Southwest. And this is because of the limits in terms of their other options beyond the work that they are funneled into. So how do we measure this power to exploit? Economists tell us that the notion of quit elasticity is a great way to measure the health of a labor market and the power to racially exploit or to exploit more generally in a monopsonistic market. So this is a term that reflects an idea called the quit elasticity. How elastic is someone's sensitivity to a drop in the wages with regard to their ability or willingness to quit? So the quit elasticity is measured by taking the percent of workers who will separate if a certain percentage of the wage is dropped. And so, for example, if the employer drops the wage by 10% and 30% of workers leave, go to other outside options, the quit elasticity is 3. So the neoclassical model, as I described, suggests that everyone quits instantly, and so the quit elasticity is infinitely large. The economists studying the subject have determined that a quit elasticity of 5 or over tends, which means 10% of a wage drop means that 50% of the workers separate. That is low power to exploit by the employer. The lower rates reflect a higher power, more power to exploit. And the real life values, as calculated by these new empiricists working on this, suggest that in general, on average, the worker populations are showing quit elasticities of between 2 and 4. It turns out, and this is in some sense the crux of the argument, that quit elasticities and quit rates are significantly lower for Black workers and workers of color more generally. For Black workers, the research suggests that their quit elasticities are 20 to 25% lower than for white workers. And this is what gives the employer the power to exploit workers of color and to funnel them into these exploited positions. Here's some research from Carr and Naidu. If the general quit elasticity is 3, for men in general, all races, 3.5, for whites, 3.1, women, 2.75, Hispanics, 2.7, Blacks, 2.4. So the lower the quit elasticity, the more power the employer has to exploit. Women in general are 2.75, Latinos are 2.7, Blacks are 2.4. And this is reflecting these racially distinctive restrictions on outside options that I mentioned in an earlier slide. So the book, after setting all of this out, then takes up 3 case studies to show in a narrative, hopefully compelling narrative way, the way in which employers in the digital economy have exploited their monopsony power that is distinctive to people of color. In the book, I discuss Apple and the launch of the Mac prototype. Apple, still working in garages, had just released the Lisa, which was the Mac predecessor, $35,000 for a personal computer. They needed affordability. They needed to, at some point, distribute 100 prototype Macs, but they didn't have anyone in the garage who could solder 100 circuit boards. They outsourced to Asian and Latina immigrant women to work in their home kitchens, exposed to lots of toxic materials, and then subsequently suffering massive reproductive injury. They sue Apple. Apple tries to sidestep the lawsuit, but eventually ends up having to pay quietly significant amounts of money to these women. Fei Li and the launch of ImageNet. Are you guys all familiar with ImageNet? So ImageNet is a academic project that this Princeton professor wanted to create 50 million images to train computers in object recognition. If you have a self-driving car, it needs to recognize a stop sign. But in order to recognize the stop sign, it needs to see millions of images of the stop sign to develop a set of rules for recognizing it. So stop signs in the evening, stop signs in the morning, stop signs from the side, stop signs that are more orange than they are red. Human beings need to label those images. So Fei Li started with her research assistants, paying them $12 an hour. Her postdoc discovers it will take her 19 years, and she will have run out of money to finish the project. The postdoc's friend walks down the hall and says, I have the answer, Amazon Turk. So Amazon Turk is an electronic job board in which electronic tasks are posted. People all over the world, but at that time, mostly India and the United States, would go on to these job boards to complete these tasks. She's able to finish the project paying about half workers from India less than $1 an hour to label these images, paying workers from the United States less than $3 an hour. She finishes under budget and on time. She goes on to become an engineer at Google and make millions of dollars. ImageNet gives rise to a very important milestone in AI and object recognition. The winner in the 3rd year of the competition develops the convolutional neural network, which is the big breakthrough, all because of these workers from India, but of course they get no deferred compensation or equity to reflect the success of the project. But the project I'm going to talk to you more about, and I can talk to you about these other case studies if you like, is Travis Kalanick and the launch of Uber, which I'm sure most people are familiar with. Ask yourself, if you're an Uber or Lyft passenger, how often do you get drivers who are immigrants or people of color in major metropolitan areas? The answer will be 90% of the time. And that's important with regard to thinking about how to launch Uber as an innovation. So just to step back for a second, you may, because you're ISP people, be very aware that in platform markets, there is a distinctive feature of platform markets, which is that they display increasing returns, which means the more success the market has, the more success the market has. Any advantage will snowball. And that's because of these feedback loops that, for example, tie the relationship between drivers and riders together. So the more drivers a ride-hail company has, the more people who are waiting around to give you a really low wait time and to give you maximum flexibility in terms of what kind of car that you want to schedule to go to the airport, the more riders will be attracted to a ride-hail company with low wait time. The more riders who are attracted means the more drivers who will drive, and you get increasing returns instead of diminishing returns, which is what happens in most commodity markets. And so if a newcomer wants to succeed in this kind of increasing returns market, they want to dominate the market as quickly as possible to capture increasing returns. And that means becoming the first mover, because if you're the first mover, you're the most popular, and then the feedback loop gets jump-started to your advantage. And so blitz scaling becomes the business strategy of choice, which means you grow your ride-hail company as fast as possible, as big as possible, because again, you want to limit the wait times and you don't want your riders to have to wait for 3 hours for a car at 2:30 on a Wednesday afternoon. And so the story of Uber is a story in which they bring on 500,000 drivers in 3 years. The full-time drivers that they hire, who are the glue, by the way, because they're the ones who are going to be out on a Wednesday afternoon at 2:30, are 70 to 90% drivers of color or immigrants. And the blitz scaling then is an important part of the story because they're able to hire them with regard to launching the project, becoming the first mover. And once they become the most popular ride-hail company, then they do two very interesting and important things for this story. First, they slash the fares of the drivers in half. Remember what the standard economic theory would predict. If you slash the wages of the driver in half, not even just 10%, everyone should scatter to outside options. They did this for the purpose of outcompeting Lyft by underpricing them. And this happens regularly and routinely every January over a 3-year period with no real reversal in terms of the fare cuts. Then at some point, you're probably aware that Uber is not profitable for a very long period of time, and the investors start getting impatient. So they decide in 2023, we are going to become profitable, and they slash fares dramatically yet again, year over year, in order to become profitable, and they increase their take from the fare. So they're both cutting fares and increasing their takes, and they tell the drivers, that's okay, you can make it up with the increase in demand. They don't mention that they'll have to work twice as hard for twice as many hours, but in fact, that doesn't even end up being true. And you can see in the graph at the top of this slide what happens to driver utilization after these fare cuts. So each starred T or time is a fare cut, and you see brief, very small reductions in the number of drivers after each fare cut, but you see growth in the number of drivers after those. And there's this sort of steady increase over time, which is a visual piece of proof that these are monopsonistic markets, because fare cuts should not result or even enable or allow for the possibility of growth in drivers unless you have people who are so desperate for jobs that they are willing to take on a job that they know where there is a fare cut already in place, and then the possibility, if not likelihood, of fare cuts in advance. And so Uber churns through workers of color, and immigrant workers. They're funneling into these exploited positions because of their lack of outside options. And these monopsonistic patterns reflect that employers have the power to exploit workers of color distinctively. Again, reflect on the fact that these full-time drivers are, in most major metropolitan areas, 90% people of color or immigrants. So there's empirical work to confirm that there are these limited outside options for the people who drive. Parrott and Reich do this study of Uber drivers to show that the immigrant and people of color who drive for ride hail, by and large, have no college degree and for various reasons have quite limited outside options. And their quit elasticities reflect those numbers that I showed you before because of those outside options. On average, this is a little dated, the wage for an Uber driver, once you take into account all of the costs associated with driving, is $9.21, less than the minimum wage in 13 out of 15 major metropolitan areas. And there's a significant number of people who don't make any money. Largely, there are people who don't, and my cousin who drives for Uber is like this, who don't tally their costs, their long-term depreciation of the car maintenance. And if they did, finally she started to when her spouse said, you've got to do the numbers. And she no longer drives for Uber. If they did, it would reflect close to zero or zero net income. So what does Uber get out of this exploitation? Why are they interested in exploiting? The things that I mentioned earlier with regard to the first mover advantage. They were able to grow explosively during their early launch, the early launch of their innovation. They were able to capture the first mover position by blitzscaling in order to outcompete others like Lyft. They weren't able to drive them out of the market, but that's only because Lyft had been the first. I didn't know this before I read this. Lyft was the first to have the non-professional driver drive their own car. And Uber actually copied Lyft and then went one better to scale up. And so the point of slashing these fares was to outcompete Lyft and then to become profitable. That was all part of the strategy. And then with regard to the population that was in many ways financing the competitive war with Lyft and the profitability, those were the full-time workers whose fares were slashed. And the population of these exploited workers continued to sign up and turn on the app. A lot of the workers whose fares were slashed did quit, but then came back because they didn't have much in the way of outside options, all contributing to this story of the monopsonistic market in which workers are exploited because of racism. Last but not least, and this I'm happy to say a lot more about, given that this is a law audience, one could say that Uber didn't create these racial barriers, that they were in some sense happening onto a market where they were really just motivated by trying to capture the first mover advantage, take as much of the fare as they could, consistent with maintaining their workforce. But they went one better. And antitrust rules actually frown on this, to take advantage of a vulnerable market, of a monopsonistic market, of a monopolistic market. They went one better by rewriting the rules of work. So they blow into states, and even though there are local ordinances that say they can't drive because they're not taxi companies, they throw a lot of money at elected representatives to persuade them to rewrite the rules with regard to taxi cabs, and they blow past the taxi drivers who are resisting this move quite vociferously, and then they undertake a campaign to rewrite the rules of work, to create, for example, these intermediate positions where the drivers get some benefits, but still have no ability to organize. They're not employees. They're not independent contractors. There's this neither fish nor fowl category that they create. And 15 states, under pressure from Uber, as a significant potential employer for their states, have rewritten the rules of work in the way that I described, including states where Uber first began: California, Washington, and New York. So this is what's in it for the employer: to jumpstart the innovation, the digital innovation, distinctively interested in the first mover advantage, unlike a lot of other markets, and people of color and immigrant drivers are the way they do it. Now, this is true for a lot of other work in terms of the kind of restrictions that I'm talking about. And I mentioned that earlier: agriculture, janitorial, domestic work. So Eric Posner said, why aren't you talking about them? And the answer that I gave, and I'd love to hear your feedback on this because I've had some conversations with my potential publisher about this. I'm interested in telling this story not just for particular areas of work, but for the areas of work that we are staking the future of our economy on. This is in many ways to reflect the kind of global capitalism launches on the global cotton economy nature of the story historically. I want to update the story to say we're still doing that. We are still envisioning advances like the digital economy, like AI, and doing so in a way that depends on, in a very underappreciated narrative, depends on the exploitation of workers of color, and again, either lens of blight, eye, causes, or some combination of the two, suffering for people of color. Okay, so what do we do about it? This is where I wave my hands to some degree. I start by saying it's a little premature to really start talking about. The legal scholars always want to jump to, well, what are we going to do about it? Science scholars say this is our first cut. We really have to understand the problem. So let me make the science claim. We really have to understand the problem. We have to get much better of a handle on the dynamics that I'm talking about. But because I know you want some hope in this story of depression and despair, the remedies that I advocate are to counteract the monopsony power by building worker power, and minoritized worker power in particular, to resist monopsony. Worker ownership, which involves not just equity, but the control of what happens to the company, and some voice. South Africa, for a brief period, contemplated taking a big pot of money that they had from unclaimed tax refunds and using that money to buy stock in their major companies up to the point where they became minority shareholders who had veto power. And if I were queen for the day and could wave my magic wand, I don't know where we would come up with the pots of money, but that kind of worker ownership and that kind of use of corporate power to push back on the monopsony power of these digital employers would be great. Unions and sectoral bargaining are more standard answers. There is, despite the inability of independent contractors to formally organize, a movement among rideshare drivers United, and among the Turker workers, Turker Nation, and they are organizing and having some success. Posner was interested in this because he was interested in the possibility of antitrust remedies with regard to monopsonistic markets. Lena Khan, a graduate of this university, was also interested in the idea of monopsony. And then last but not least, wage boards that set wages. This is something that Europe does quite a bit of. I'm interested in that with regard to the requirement of deferred options. So if a digital employer hires a programmer and can't pay the programmer at the outset in a startup, frequently what they do is negotiate a deferred compensation package or some equity. The reason they don't do that for the drivers is because they don't need to, and that's in part because of the restricted options, plus a whole lot of other stuff with regard to salaried workers. Let's make the drivers look like the programmers. So I'm going to leave it there. I'll take questions. I see hands going up already. I think we go till 1:30. And I'm told that I control the queue. Yes.
So thank you for this presentation. I have a question regarding the correct classification of the platform workers. Can you hear me?
If you could speak up a little, I know I need a hearing aid. I'm in the process of getting.
Try this.
Yes,
Great.
thank you.
Thank you for this presentation.
Thank you.
I have a question regarding the correct classification of the platform workers. So
Yes.
how should evaluate the proposals for a third category? You said there are interim models, not employees.
Right.
And
Right.
And under the pressure of Uber, they are rewriting the rules.
Right.
You mentioned.
Yes.
So do these proposals, the third category proposals, risk taking and formalizing this exploitative models, or they can be a pragmatic tools for protecting the workers' rights? Because at least they are providing a base for these workers, so now they cannot be considered as independent workers.
Right.
So, and I have another question.
Wait, so what was the question? I mean, I heard you describe the creation of these intermediate.
Risk to regulate the third category,
Yes,
or is it that
Yes.
give us a base to protect these workers?
yes,
At least we have a third category.
yes,
So this is my question.
yes. Okay, let's start with that. And then if you have a follow-up and nobody else has a question immediately, I'll answer it. So you're posing the dilemma of either we innovate and do so effectively with regard to independent contractors, because now we can cut our costs by a third, or we protect the workers. Isn't it great that we have this intermediate category? And I think to the extent that that accurately reflects the nature of your question, one has to step back and understand what makes this binary choice, the set of background conditions and understandings that make this binary choice that you framed as a choice. And that is to think about what that looks like with regard to computer programmers. Because the computer programmers have a lot more power, there isn't this either we exploit them or protect them. It is the presence of worker power that demands that if they want programmers to come work for them, they have to provide deferred compensation. So to ask what they should do against this background market set of conditions that is monopsonistic, I think is a waste of time. That trying to figure out what to do when workers do not have power is short-sighted, a Band-Aid, and ultimately will inevitably fall pressure to innovators' pressures to cut costs and to make their startup as lean as possible. So I want to sidestep that framing of the choice to say, build worker power. When there is no more monopsonistic power, then we'll talk about categories.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for this. I work here, but I also represent Uber Lyft drivers organization here.
Oh, excellent.
This is small. But so rather than ask the million questions I have, I'll just ask one, which is.
Please email me your million questions, because I really would be interested. Yep. Yep.
Yeah, I am curious. One just larger piece is just, I think that the racial politics also have a lot to do with how these companies were able to come in and undermine existing law in order to create chaos.
Right. Undermine the taxi industry.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Exactly, the taxi industry, but also just undermine employment rights.
Right.
Specifically, what I mean is, you know, who the racial formation of this group of workers as minoritized workers is really important on its own terms, but it's also important to understanding why in the United States, Uber, Lyft, and these other companies form such close attachments to the Democratic Party.
Right. That's right.
And that. Does that resonate with you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you see the NAACP getting out and saying, people of color, come and work for Uber. They co-opt the leadership in many of these communities, they co-opt the leadership of the Democratic Party. And the thinking is, and I want to acknowledge that this is in many ways the thinking that creates this problem. We're going to give them jobs. They have no jobs now. We're giving them an opportunity. And this is why the definition of exploitation is so important. This is the answer that I got at the University of Chicago when I presented this talk. Well, India is being paid, you know, prevailing wages, and at least they have jobs. But the comparison isn't job, no job. The comparison is fair market labor value of the labor contributed versus something below that. Exploited wage versus fair wage, not no wage versus exploited wage. And that, I think, isn't something that the Democratic Party has, for political economy reasons, really wanted to acknowledge, because of course, you know who's financing their reelection campaigns. That's a big part of why they do what they do. Yes.
On that note, I want to offer maybe a distinction that there's multiple kinds of harm going on here, obviously, but that to the worker who is setting the wage floor here, who is willing to take that wage,
right,
because they have family in
right,
a different country where that is a more acceptable wage.
right.
The harm to them seems to be a dignitary harm in the United States, because the wage is acceptable to
right.
them. So the harm is dignitary.
For immigrants in the US who are sending money back. Yes.
The harm is dignitary because like they could,
yes.
you know, it's not.
It's also economic harm, though, to the extent that they're living in the US, they're having to deal with US standards of living.
Right.
It's more interesting to talk about the workers in India, but yes,
Like
yes,
in India, who's being paid
right,
a good wage for India is
right,
still suffering the dignitary harm because
right,
if they were being paid
right.
fair, the marginal rate.
And just, can I just interject there to say, these workers in India who were working for Fei Li were computer engineers. And they had no options to work as computer engineers because they hadn't set up the sweatshops yet to work for overseas. So they were doing this labeling work. So dignitary harm is a great way to frame that.
Mm-hmm. And then it seems like there's a secondary economic harm to, as you were just saying before, like the workers who are now displaced, who had unions, who had taxi jobs where you have to like,
right,
you know, do all these things. And so then the dignitary harm, like the direct cause of that is Uber, the company, because they are in the position to pay the marginal rate, the exploitation rate, as you call
right.
it. But then the cause of the economic harm is the influx of venture capital that allowed Uber to
right,
penetrate a market that was already existing,
right,
and was paying workers a fair wage.
right.
And so it's,
I don't know that I would go quite that far, but yes,
okay, well,
yes,
I'm supposing that maybe there's
yeah,
like separate boogeymen for these separate harms.
yes, I like that.
As you said, like Uber
Right.
was not profitable for the longest time.
Right.
So
it's all about venture capital.
Right.
That's right.
Billions of dollars. Of venture
That's right.
capital, and that's what makes the tech case unique.
Right.
This isn't happening in
Yes.
agriculture.
No, that's a great point. That this lack of profitability is made possible only by venture capital. And the venture capitalists were looking at the long game.
Yeah.
And they were looking at the long game against a backdrop of assumptions that relied on minoritized drivers
Yes.
as the key to the kingdom. I would say there's some great work by Veena Dubal, who talks about what was happening to the taxi industry before Uber showed up. And it had already been decimated. You probably know the medallion story in New York. It had become quite minoritized at a point in time where they shifted to the medallion system instead of treating taxi drivers as employees. So that happened early on. And so in many ways, it was the crabs in a barrel story where Black and brown and immigrant taxi drivers were now being displaced by Black and brown and immigrant Uber drivers, but they had already in some sense taken the hit from this independent contractor medallion model. But absolutely, I love the point that you made that there are separate boogeymen and women for separate categories of harm. So thank you. Yes.
So I am wondering about your borrowing from the antitrust concept of monopsony and
Yes.
Your definition of exploitative wages.
Yes.
is certainly like correlated to the existence of monopsony power. So if they have
Yes.
monopsony power, by definition, they can pay
Right.
or what you're calling exploitative wages. But in order for a company's conduct to constitute a violation of the antitrust law,
Yes.
under Section 2, that you have to show not just the possession of monopsony power,
Right.
but also exclusionary conduct.
Yes.
And so I was watching through your presentation for instances that looked like
Yes.
exclusionary conduct.
Yes.
I think the closest that we came was Uber's manipulation of local laws or
Yes.
regulations. But then I think if that's the exclusionary conduct you're going to point to, that's a really
Yes.
tough one. because
Absolutely.
then you run very quickly into the, well, especially
Of course.
legislation, an invalid tool of competition.
Absolutely. Yes.
You get the doctrine of like First Amendment protection.
Yes. Yes.
So
You're absolutely right.
I wonder, and maybe this is just because your piece is not attempting to be an antitrust piece. It's
Yes.
simply attempting to borrow conceptually, but
Right.
the antitrust laws protect a pretty deep moral intuition.
Yes.
Which is that if you benefit from historical accident, which
Yes.
in this case would be the extrinsic
Right.
nature of structural racism in the United States, right? Then you ought not to be held liable. for the property
Yes.
taken without due process.
Yes.
Right, so how do you, even
Yep.
if you're just borrowing as a conceptual framework?
Yes.
How do you deal with that moral
Yes.
intuition that maps on?
So great question. Two things to say. First, this is exactly why Eric Posner and Suresh and I do conclude that antitrust remedies are inadequate. Because exactly of what you say with regard to what constitutes the exclusionary conduct that creates the predicate for liability, given that this is a historical accident. So yes, antitrust as a technical matter is not going to be on the list of, as it's currently framed, is not going to be on the list of real world remedies. But the other thing to say is, and this is where I need to do a deeper dive, it is prohibited employers are prohibited from exploiting the historical accident in particular ways as currently defined with regard to exclusionary conduct. But in my view, and this does not fit the definition of exclusionary conduct, rewriting the rules of work to, in some sense, amplify. So the creation of this third category, for example, amplifies and enables scaling up of the degree of exploitation. So antitrust law presupposes that laws look as they do with regard to what is defined as exclusionary conduct, what is defined as permissible. But part of the monopsony power gives the employer the power to rewrite the legal rules. And so to the extent that you've created this third category, it's no longer potentially exclusionary conduct because now look, it's legal. I don't know that it would have, I don't want to be read as saying that it would have fit the definition of exclusionary conduct because it wouldn't. But the more general thing to say is that this adds a layer of complexity when power includes the power to rewrite the legal rules and to make the point that the rewriting of those rules should be considered part of the universe of behavior. And this is Lena Khan's idea, that regulation needs to happen with that in mind.
Under existing doctrine, what I would look up is the Noor-Pennington doctrine. You
Yes.
probably already familiar with
Yes.
it. That's a doctrine that says that essentially anything that companies do
Yep.
that is speech or that is
Yes.
protected cannot be a basis for
Yes.
antitrust liability, which seems to directly prohibit an expansion of the antitrust laws in the direction that you would advocate.
Yes, although it could be considered speech conduct, but we could have absolutely, it's not the, it's the, one could say it was the breaking of those laws before the rules had been rewritten. And, but what you're saying maps onto a much larger body of literature that talks about political economy, the capture of legislation making, and the way in which that absolutely escapes liability under things like the Noor-Pennington doctrine. So thank you for the exchange. Yes.
So first of all, thank you so much for this presentation. It's very timely and very important. I think everybody felt that.
Thank you.
Yes, so my question is less, so I'm a media and communications scholar, so my question is less legalistic, but more to do with the digital sphere. And from what I'm getting, this is definitely, like, what you're describing here is a story of an exacerbation of something that has already been the case since, since the beginning of the internet, probably, with the idea of exploitation of workers of color, of racism, of everything you're describing. And I'm interested if you see this point right now as something new. I mean, with emerging technologies like AI, for instance,
Yep.
are we in a new type of economy that's emerging right now because of these technologies, or is this something that is just basically an even more worse exacerbation?
I would say it's both and. So when you think about this as an extension of the launch of the global cotton economy, there are definitely connections, but obviously part of the point of the book is to say this is something that's distinctive with regard to the digital economy generally, digital platforms in particular, because of the first mover advantage, and the way in which extreme exploitation is a prerequisite for someone agreeing to take a job in which they have no benefits, they have to pay for their car, they have no ability to organize, no retirement, no overtime, no sick leave. Someone has to be pretty exploited to sign up for that job, even in the face of drastic pay cuts. I will say that if you restrict the time period for defining something as new as the beginning of the internet, this is one of the reasons I included the Apple story, because it's not a platform story, but it is, we don't have the ability, we need to outsource. This wasn't outsourcing in the same way that Uber outsources with this in mind as a business model. But there were network externalities that drove Apple. In fact, the original story is in some sense the Microsoft operating system. So software authors write for the operating system. The operating system is now marketable to a wider group of consumers because look, there's all this software. So, but I will say what is new is this new empirical work that talks about monopsony power, and hopefully my original contribution, which is, and this isn't something that Suresh Posner or Naidu have done, although Naidu and I had this conversation and then he put out a little paper with the elasticities for people of color, which is to focus on the unbelievable racial disparity in these worker populations. And so for me, looking at a digital worker population, if they're between 80 and 90% people of color, I think my spidey sense is going off. There are these dynamics at work here. And so the recognition of the dynamics of exploitation in many ways shines a light now on what has been inevitably happening, at least since the beginning of the digital platform. Yes. Yes.
So you were talking about how this process go before the platform economy. And
yes.
In this case, it's about the Navajo, the Native Americans community.
Yes, the Navajo.
The first microchips
yes.
factories were built.
Yes, yes, absolutely, yes.
But two questions. First, are you familiar with the concept of overexploitation? We have, like, in Latin America, this tradition of what they call capitalism independent, that talks about racial capitalism, and this idea that is based on Marxist theory, but that talks about these workers who permanently, in a structural way, earns less than the wage floor in Latin America. And
so what's it called?
Overexploitation.
Overexploitation.
In the meaning that it's not surplus, but it's beyond surplus.
Right. So say more about that, because I am very interested to hear about this and I want you to send me names of people I should read. But what I'm really interested in understanding is what distinguishes the exploited from the overexploited? What is the mechanism that explains this difference in Latin American theory?
Perfect. Can talk later about it.
Okay.
Just two questions. First, one problem for cooperative platform, it's the problem of network effects.
Yes.
So you have, for example, Up and Go, there is this cooperatively owned digital gig platform in New York that most of the workers are Latin American women. Most of these experiences are really small. They never. So what's your?
They don't scale up. Yeah.
This kind of solution for this problem.
Yeah.
And the other is, what do you think about what's happening right now, the role of the state in this? I mean, when people are terrified of ICE, probably they are going to set even lower
Absolutely.
fares. So how the
Right.
But at the same time, if there is a real dangers of people of having a real effect on mass migration, deportation, this also affects
Absolutely. Absolutely.
How do you think about this rule?
So I think about that with a lot of alcohol, because I think there's nothing to really say with regard to a response to how that changes given the current political landscape. As to your, and I know that's an inadequate answer, but I really don't have a broader one except to say absolutely right, that to the extent that the conditions of immigration law deepen the lack of meaningful outside options, then immigrants become an even larger portion of the exploited population. And there's a lot to say about whether Uber or Lyft should be checking for legal status. As I remember, Uber has now started to do that. Lyft did not for a long time, but I think that under the current architectural frameworks of immigration law and politics that they are now going to. In terms of your first question, I think the idea of scaling up worker cooperatives like Drivers Rideshare United reflect the fact, that the tradition of unions in this country is a shell of its former self, and B, that's because of changes made by capital to the rules of organizing. The labor law is a shell of its former self. And one easy fix would be, and this is happening at the state level in some states, for example, in California, state law giving workers the ability to organize to some degree without the full federal National Labor Relations Act protections, but some form of protection at the state level. But that third category, to the extent that they're rewriting these rules, there should be a huge focus and emphasis on that third category, including the right to organize, because then you have the kinds of supports and protection that national labor law, federal labor law provides. That might create the opportunity for some larger scaling up, but again, without worker power, the ability to organize becomes quite difficult. And this is why I prefaced my remedies section by saying I'm going to wave my hands a lot. And that's because there are no ideal answers short of the South Africa option, which is, of course, a complete pipe dream in the US generally, and the US right now in particular, an impossibility. So this becomes an academic exercise to talk about.
And what about state-owned platforms? In the US,
state-owned platforms, yes. 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 I have not thought a whole lot about state-owned platforms per se. I've thought about state ownership more generally, but I've dismissed that for the reasons that you just articulated. That's not a thing that's going to happen here in the US. In South Africa, it's more of an opportunity. They have particular industries that are nationalized, and that reflects a very different culture with regard to labor, with regard to Black labor in particular, and a very different take on what worker power looks like, just by virtue of the fact that the numbers are very different. Chinmayi?
Thank you.
Flip a call.
presentation, the last time you did it, 2018,
Oh my God, was it 2018? Yes, yes,
Daniel's class, but
yes.
I was fascinated even then, and I continue to be because I've been on the India end of this for some years, and I think that this whole this idea of capital changing laws, I love that, it's spot on. That's been my baby steps into LPE.
Yep.
And it's been true, given that you're looking at workers in India, there was a change of law, very much.
Yes. Oh, I want to talk to you about that. Okay.
I'll send you the stuff. I mean,
Yep.
I was unfortunately doing my years in corporate law. I'm trying to undo that bad karma, partly to do with the software technology parks in Bangalore, which were
Yes,
explicitly areas in which labor law didn't apply,
yes,
to create sites in which a job was considered better. So I also love that other connection that you're making of of almost complicity in offering certain groups a job,
right,
without considering what that means in the long term.
right.
And so this is a very long-winded way of kind of asking if you're also going down a path that considers the way in which these people are herded into these opportunities.
Uh-huh.
That computer engineer answer that you gave.
Yes.
I read a paper that described how the companies were advertising.
Yes.
ImageNet,
Absolutely.
like they were
Right, they were computer engineering jobs. Yes.
and that has two pieces to
Yes.
it.
Oh, I like this. I want that paper too. Okay.
Outside of that, so I can find it.
Yes.
So part of the story is the information asymmetry one, which you told, which is
Right.
some people have access to more information than others.
Right.
But I suspect, this is a hunch, part of it I think is also targeting. This is what I think Diana
Yes,
said.
absolutely. Yes.
Was-
Yes. And this is what I was asking her about. Yes. Yes, absolutely. So where did Uber go to hire its full-time drivers? Black Entertainment Television, BET. Same sort of thing, be your own boss. Advertising these independent contractor jobs as though they were now going to become entrepreneurs, as though they could negotiate the terms of their contract, when in fact, this was anything but. So absolutely.
Yeah, I think there's a lot there, the intentional exploitation of
Yes.
a specific community. That is-
Yes. Yes. And so back to the earlier question about what conduct do we get them for, the antitrust question that this woman asked, the question of targeting, I don't know that that's not illegal, right? Look, we're giving them jobs. But targeting them for sub-minimum wage work, well, that's just a function of the market and what the market will bear without attention and the monopsony conditions. I think it becomes a kind of house of mirrors in terms of what gets defined as it's part of the bigger picture story that we can tell. Targeting, false advertising, fraud, maybe, but that really captures only, and this is what prosecutors do all the time, right? A very small part of what is wrong about, or what is problematic about this bigger picture story. So this is what digital innovators do. Their real innovation is figuring out legally how to create these new forms of work by either fitting them into existing law that sanctions everything they're doing, or when it doesn't, by rewriting the rules. And that goes back to the conversation that we were having, requiring that this story acknowledge that currently this is all mostly legal. Yeah.
I'll say one more, although you probably have it. Mark Graham had this thing about how it also presents this whole thing as a competition between a pool of laborers in Kenya and India versus Brazil.
Yes.
Like solidarity.
Yes. Yes.
Collective bargaining across.
I think that's right. And that goes back to the earlier question about where are the immigrants in terms of, or do we think of them as US immigrants sending money back to families, immigrants in India doing work that is virtual, so they're working in the United States, but not in the United States, and the arbitrage that happens when you have countries that compete against each other that are former colonies, all by the same British Empire. So I would love to talk to you more about that. Let's set up a time to chat. Caleb?
Yeah, thanks. That's really interesting. So I guess my question is more, and I'm sure you've thought about this more in the project. I'm interested in sort of how you maybe disaggregate within the category, because I think you frequently mention like minoritized and immigrant workers.
Yeah.
And it seems
Yes.
to me that the reasons that different sort of like subcategories within
Yes, absolutely.
might have limited
Yes.
options, right, are quite
Yes.
different, and even within the category of immigrant.
Yep.
Immigration status
Right.
is really important.
Right.
And I think it's helpful to sort of maybe like disaggregate that, especially I think when it comes to the remedies.
Yes.
So let's just take the example of independent contractors status, right? So my understanding is that the federal government's e-verify requirements only apply to people with employment, who are employees.
Right. Right.
And this actually.
This is why Uber didn't do it. And
Right, exactly.
right.
But then that's also why a lot of these jobs where you are classified as an independent contractor are attracted
Right.
to undocumented
That's right.
immigrants because they don't have to go through e-verify.
Yes.
And so then I think when you get to the state of remedies,
Yes.
let's say your remedies, and a lot of states have rolled back, right? Like have basically passed laws saying that Uber and Lyft drivers, rideshare drivers, should be classified as employees rather than
Right.
contractors. That might then.
And then the left hand, exactly.
So I feel like
Right.
it's helpful to think about some of those attractions and the ways in
Absolutely.
which improving the conditions for
Yes.
one category within the sort of like
Right.
they're interested in might actually, in some sense, be
Hurt the people that you're trying to help. Absolutely. I think that's a very important point. I do plan to disaggregate. I do plan to talk a little bit about the e-verify quandary, but you're convincing me that I need to talk about it more than I had planned to do because they were really just going to be an aside and footnotes. So absolutely. And I think it is also important to get a handle in terms of the numbers on disaggregating what percentage are immigrants, what percentage are people of color, what percentage are immigrants of color, because in many ways they're the most restricted. Yeah, oh, great point. Any other questions? Yes, and then take me off to a waiting Lyft driver. This is research I do. I always ask my driver about what they think about what it is I'm saying, and they have stories to tell.
Yeah, I've been threatening to do this since 2018, so I'm very.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation.
I mean, I'm delighted you accepted it. To those who've taken Daniel's seminar, and Abby runs it now, I was supposed to do Daria's dinner and the pandemic got in the way. So I was like, I'm owed a dinner, which I don't.
Yes, yes.
And yeah, I'm very happy to see the project progress. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Insiders, you know about the newsletter, but if anyone in the room is not getting the ISP newsletter and you want to be informed of our events, heather.branch@yale.edu.
Yes. Thank you so much. And let me encourage anybody who has additional questions or observations to email me. I really want to engage because I think people have distinctive perspectives that I'm always eager to hear from. So thank you.